or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the yeas or nays are ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up the Chair's resolution authorizing the issuance of certain subpoenas for documents and testimony for purposes of markup, and move that the committee agree to the resolution. The clerk will report the resolution.
Resolution offered by Chairman Gerald Nadler. Resolved that upon the adoption of this resolution, the Chairman of the Committee on the Judiciary is authorized to issue subpoenas.
Without objection, the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. In late 1973, the Nixon administration had an idea. When Special Counsel Archibald Cox asked the White House to turn over recordings of conversations held in the Oval Office, President Nixon offered instead to provide the tapes to Senator John Stennis of Mississippi. Nixon proposed that Stennis, who was famously hard of hearing, would listen to the recordings himself, then provide summaries of the tapes to the special prosecutor. The Nixon administration justified the proposal as a means to protect sensitive information that would not ordinarily be made part of the record. In hindsight, of course, we know that President Nixon had ulterior motives. In any event, Cox had a job to do. That job required him to evaluate the full record for himself, and he refused the president's offer. President Nixon ordered him fired the next day. The dynamics of the Stennis Compromise, as it became known, should sound familiar to us. The Trump administration has an idea. They want to redact the Mueller report before they provide it to Congress. The Department of Justice says the proposal is a means to protect sensitive information that would not ordinarily be made part of the record. But we have reason to suspect this administration's motives. The Mueller report probably isn't the, quote, total exoneration, unquote, the president claims it to be. And in any event, the committee has a job to do. The Constitution charges Congress with holding the president accountable for alleged official misconduct. That job requires us to evaluate the evidence for ourselves, not the Attorney General's summary, not a substantially redacted synopsis, but the full report and the underlying evidence. The Attorney General proposes to redact 4 categories of information from the Mueller report: grand jury information, classified information, information related to ongoing prosecutions, and, quote, information that may unduly infringe on the personal privacy and reputational interests of peripheral third parties, close quote. The Department is wrong to try to withhold that information from this committee. Congress is entitled to all of the evidence. This isn't just my opinion. It is also a matter of law. For precedent on 3 of the 4 categories, we need look no further than the summer of 2016, when, pursuant to congressional subpoena, the Department and the FBI began to transfer more than 880,000 documents related to the Clinton investigation to the House of Representatives. That production included classified information, which we held in our secure facility and which we handle every day. It included information related to ongoing investigations, and it included information related to numerous third parties, many of whom this committee later interviewed as part of the Republican investigation into the investigation. The other category of information the Attorney General proposes to redact is grand jury information, normally protected under Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. Many who seem eager to keep this information from Congress argue that the law does not allow grand jury information to be shared outside the Justice Department. That analysis is incomplete, if not outright incorrect. It is true that Rule 6E ordinarily prohibits the Department from sharing grand jury information with the public. It is also true that, with proper authorization and under court order, the Department must share grand jury information with this committee. That was the case in 1974, when Judge Sirica authorized the release of the Watergate roadmap to this committee at the request of Special Counsel Leon Jaworski. It was the case in 1998, when a federal court permitted Ken Starr to release grand jury information along with his report to Congress. It was the case in 2008 and 2009, when this committee went directly to the grand jury twice to get information relevant to our investigation of Judge Thomas Porteous. On multiple occasions, I have asked Attorney General Barr to work with us to go to the court and obtain access to materials the department deems covered by Rule 6E. He has so far refused. I will give him time to change his mind, but if we cannot reach an accommodation, then we will have no choice but to issue subpoenas for these materials. And if the department still refuses, then it should be up to a judge, not the president and not his political appointee, to decide whether or not it is appropriate for the committee to review the complete record. The resolution before us today authorizes subpoenas for two categories of information. First, the resolution authorizes subpoenas for documents and testimony related to the full and unredacted report of Special Counsel Mueller. I believe the committee must have access to this information in order to perform its constitutionally mandated responsibility. The House of Representatives agreed with this proposition when last month it voted 420 to 0 in support of a resolution that demanded the release of the full report. Second, the resolution authorizes subpoenas for documents and testimony from certain former White House employees. Each of these individuals has had more than a month to produce documents to this committee voluntarily. We believe that these individuals may have received documents from the White House in preparation for their interviews with the special counsel. We also believe that these individuals may have turned this information over to their private attorneys. Under applicable federal law, President Trump waived his claims to executive privilege once this information was transmitted to outside counsel. Because we may have to go to court to obtain the complete text of the special counsel's report, and because the president may attempt to invoke executive privilege to withhold that evidence from us, it is imperative that the committee take possession of these documents and others without delay. Yesterday, the president presented me with the high honor of not one, but 3 separate mentions on Twitter. He also talked about our relationship, which goes back several years, in a press conference yesterday afternoon. President Trump seems to think in 1998 I was opposed to public release of the Starr report and that he has caught me changing my mind on the subject. Let me set the record straight. In 1998, the debate was not about Congress receiving evidence. Congress had already received the full 445-page report and 17 boxes of additional documents, including grand jury material. We are owed that same opportunity today. In 1998, the central debate was about the public release of some of the materials accompanying the Starr report, materials that Congress already had and that described private sexual acts in lurid detail. Congress has no business broadcasting graphic accounts of the president's sex life. It was inappropriate in 1998. It would be inappropriate today. Our focus should be on the law. That is where our focus will remain so long as I am chairman. We are dealing now not with the president's private affairs, but with a sustained attack on the integrity of the republic by the president and his closest advisors. This committee requires the full report and the underlying materials because it is our job, not the Attorney General's, to determine whether or not President Trump has abused his office. And we require the report because one day, one way or another, the country will move on from President Trump. We must make it harder for future presidents to behave this way. We need a full accounting of the president's actions to do that work. Accordingly, I urge my colleagues to support the resolution. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we begin today, I want to point out something that I never thought would actually happen. Jay Johnson and I actually agree about something. The former secretary and I actually agree that there is a crisis on our southern border. And by doing so, we actually agree that we need to do something about it. Unfortunately, as we saw in the first quarter of this committee, we're starting the second quarter of this committee off in the same vein, and that is desperately searching for something on the president. When we understand this, then we begin to look. Because instead of dealing with issues that this committee is authorized and should be dealing with, we're moving on to subpoenas, and that for several reasons I cannot support. The first, the subpoena for the Mueller report and its underlying evidence commands the Attorney General to do really what the unthinkable is. Remember, this is something to remind folks. The Starr report and the Mueller investigation were not under the same authorization. We keep conflating that around here. They were not. And this is why we need to understand this. Basically what we're now saying is we're going to break and asking the Attorney General to break his regulations to break the law. The Attorney General's entire mandate is to enforce the law, and he's expressly forbidden from providing grand jury outside the department in a very limited and narrow exceptions. Congress is not one of the exceptions, and the chairman knows it, and I would disagree with his characterization. I respect my chairman, but I'll disagree with his characterization of the Starr report because they're under different regulations. They were put out and sent out, but when it came to grand jury material, it was material that by law must be kept secret. It's grand jury material. It represents statements which may or may not be true by various witnesses. I wish many would understand that. Salacious material, all kinds of material that would be unfair to release. Those are not Doug Collins' words. Those are my chairman's words. This was at a time in which this is not a new idea. Right now, the only thing is there's a hope against hope that we're going to find something. It was just actually said, we need to start now so we can begin to go down to the courtroom because we know we're not going to find anything. And even if it did, and I love the comment just a moment ago, that there may be, and I love how we do this, may be things in there that is not for up to the Attorney General to decide right or wrong. It was not. It was Mueller's investigation that the Attorney General passed on. Here's what we found. This is the problem we're seeing right now. But you know something? A different political landscape compels the chairman to adopt new standards of fairness, ignoring existing law and demanding material he once considered unfair to be released. As much as the chairman and I may want to view this material, it is fundamental underpinning of our justice system, and the law we cannot. In the face of laws and rules he finds inconvenient, the chairman demands our nation's top law enforcement officer to break the rules and the regulations and the law. This is reckless, it's irresponsible, and it's disingenuous. It's also confusing since the Attorney General is doing exactly what he said he would be doing, making as much of the report public as possible under federal law and departmental policy, under regulations, understand this for the media here today, under regulations written by Janet Reno and other Democrats don't require him to do this but in the name of transparency, he is. He may even furnish us the report as early as next week, yet the chairman plows ahead. What's the rush? Spring break, probably. We don't want to wait till May. We don't want to wait till the report comes out. The Attorney General has never said he's not going to provide exactly what the regulations say he's to provide. Why are we doing this again? Because I guess we're going out of town and we don't want anybody to forget we're doing something. We need a press release. We need to name people. The interesting thing here is, second, the subpoenas in this wonderfully vague deal that we're voting on today, aimed at 5 individuals, are completely misguided. Quite simply, they're to the wrong people. Understand what I'm getting ready to tell you. 2 of the individuals are cooperating with the ill-advised investigation. Remember the 81 letters? Have provided over 3,000 pages of documents. The chairman is rewarding their cooperation by announcing their subpoenas before even notifying their lawyers. The other 3 individuals responded to Chairman Nadler's initial inquiry and have indicated willingness to cooperate. Democrats never followed up with their lawyers either. In fact, my investigators have had more contact with some of the individuals on the 81 initial letters than the majority has. These 3 individuals could not have any documents responsive to the original request because those responsive documents all came during their time at the White House, making them presidential records. None of these 3 have custody of responsive documents. The chairman knows this as well because they have received letters on this. Why would we ignore such obvious facts? Because Judiciary Democrats conduct oversight via press release. Their investigation into 81 Trump associates has yielded not the dividends they were looking for. After 1 month, the only revelation is something we knew already. They've embarrassed themselves by prejudging conclusions that the president obstructed justice. Now we've acknowledged the next stop in the grinding political axis and the governing. What is amazing here is despite the fact nearly 30 others have received Chairman letter have not responded at all, and despite everything going on. So the message is clear. Here's what's happening. If you cooperate with this committee, you will get a subpoena. If you ignore it, Democrats will return the favor. This seems like a counterintuitive way to conduct oversight, but it does sound familiar. Remember the acting Attorney General, Mr. Whitaker, who agreed to come, who agreed to sit here, and was yet rewarded with a subpoena? And oh, by the way, before he ever got here, we caved, we just did away with the subpoena. I'm not sure the purpose of the subpoena with this majority. It seems to be we want to use it because it sounds good, but yet when it comes down, we don't want to use it. And now we're back at it again because this is all preemptive. 5 of the people who have been actually listed in this for subpoenas today have been cooperating or have given advice to this committee, but have never really been followed up on. And what they have said is, we're helping, but you're now giving us a subpoena. And as far as the Attorney General's gone, he said, I'm giving you the Mueller report. I'm giving it to you, as I should under regulations. But undoubtedly, that's not enough. Undoubtedly, that doesn't make enough press releases. So I guess what we do is we put people's names on a press release. We tell them that we're going to subpoena them now, although they've actually already cooperated. You know, it reminds me of what I'm having here, and I've made this comment many times. I respect my chairman, but we just disagree on this, and that's the way that it'll be, and that's the way we're going to have it. But it reminds me of the old guys back in my hometown when they wanted to go fishing and nothing was biting. They just take a big fishing trip and go out, nothing was biting, and one day this old guy just got tired of it. Instead of catching anything the way he should, he just reaches in his back pocket, pulls out a piece of dynamite, and throws it in the pond. I can't find anything, so I'm just going to blow up everything, and maybe something will come to the top. This committee is better than this. This committee can do this better. Why are we here today doing preemptive subpoenas? Because we're going to be out for a while. We're not going to be here for a while, and we need to keep the story rolling. The story rolling is there's some innuendo, there's some possibilities that may be in this report, but we can't wait to see it. Unfortunately, what will happen, my friends, is this. Christmas will come again. They opened a present that they thought early nothing was there. Now they're dying to open another president. At the end of the day, this president, and what the report of the Mueller Convention said, was no collusion. There's no obstruction. And when we understand that, when we move forward with that, if we can't get what we want, we'll try and try again. Maybe that's the new theme of this committee. The little train that kept looking for something that says, I'll try, and I'll try, and I'll try. But at the end of the day, the president's still the president, the economy is still moving forward, the regulations that we put in place are there, and at this point in time, the Attorney General, although he has been smeared repeatedly, is doing exactly what the regulation says. And for that, congratulations, Mr. Attorney General. You get a subpoena. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to a resolution offered by Mr. Nadler. Strike all after the resolving clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
As base text.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
As base text for purposes of amendment.
Mr. Chairman, there's an objection to the...
I will finish the sentence and then I will recognize the objection.
Okay. Well, go right ahead.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. Will the gentleman explain his objection?
Yeah, I want it read. I object.
Oh, you want the resolution read? Very well. The clerk will read the resolution. The clerk will read the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to a resolution offered by Mr. Nadler. Strike all after the resolving clause and insert the following. That upon the adoption of this resolution, the chairman of the Committee on the Judiciary is authorized to issue subpoenas for documents and testimony relating to the following. Final report authored by the Office of the Special Counsel Robert Mueller III, pursuant to Order Number 3915/2017, and any accompanying exhibits, annexes, tables, appendices, other attachments, and all evidence referred to in the report. And underlying evidence collected, materials prepared, or documents used by the Office of the Special Counsel Robert Mueller III in the investigation conducted pursuant to Order Number 3915/2017. In addition, the chairman, at his discretion and as he determines necessary, is authorized to issue subpoenas for documents and testimony to the following individuals or to agents who may have received documents from the White House relevant to the investigation on Special Counsel Robert Mueller III, conducted pursuant to Order Number 3915/2017, thereby affecting a waiver of potential applicable privileges. Donald F. McGahn II, Stephen Bannon, Hope Hicks, Reince Priebus, and Donaldson. This resolution is adopted pursuant to Rule 4 of the Committee on the Judiciary and Clause 2M of Rule 11 of the U.S. House of Representatives.
I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment makes only technical changes to the underlying resolution. I would like to use my time to elaborate on the point made in my opening statement, that there is ample precedent from other investigations involving allegations of wrongdoing by the President for the Judiciary Committee to receive not just the full report, but all of the underlying evidence, including grand jury material. In the investigation of Bill Clinton, the independent counsel Ken Starr produced to Congress a 445-page report, several thousand pages of appendices, and 17 boxes of underlying evidence and other materials. These boxes included all of the grand jury information protected by Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. The Starr report and the underlying evidence and materials produced to this committee fill up volume after volume of the record in the Clinton impeachment proceedings. I am holding up only 2 of these many volumes that contain some of the evidence and materials underlying the Starr report that he produced to Congress. Here is Here is volume 4, part 2 and part 3 that contain supplemental materials from the Starr report. All of these materials were delivered to the House immediately after Ken Starr completed the report. Looking at volume 4, part 3, it is filled with the grand jury testimony and other evidence from the Starr investigation that was produced to the House Judiciary Committee. For example, on page 3,341, there is grand jury testimony of Stacey Desmond Porter. Here is a copy of it. There were boxes and boxes of such information produced by Ken Starr. Starr sought and obtained authorization from the court overseeing the grand jury to share the grand jury materials with Congress. A similar order permitting Congress to receive the grand jury materials in the Mueller investigation can and should be obtained here. The materials produced to Congress by Starr also included the interview memoranda of the witnesses who agreed to be voluntarily interviewed by Starr's office during his investigation, all of which were produced to the House Judiciary Committee. For example, on page 3523, there is one of the many memorandum of investigation interviews of witnesses by Starr and his staff. This one is of Deborah Ann Schiff. Here is a copy of it. There were boxes of such information produced by Ken Starr. The same type of information has to be produced here, especially when there were approximately 500 witnesses interviewed in the Mueller investigation, as the Attorney General stated in his March 24th letter to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. In the Watergate investigation, the Justice Department did exactly the same thing after the grand jury, considering evidence, issued a report describing potentially criminal acts by President Nixon. The Justice Department filed briefs fully supporting disclosure of the report to the House Judiciary Committee and made the point that, quote, the need for the House to be able to make its profoundly important judgment on the basis of all available information is as compelling as any that could be conceived, close quote. And here are just 2 of the volumes from the Nixon impeachment proceedings that include some of the grand jury material, just some of the grand jury material that was produced to Congress, volumes 7 and 8 from the hearings before the House Judiciary Committee. Looking at volume 7, it is filled with grand jury testimony and other evidence from the investigation that was produced to the House Judiciary Committee. For example, on page 688 of volume 8, there is the grand jury testimony of Rosemary Woods. Here is a copy of it. There were volumes and volumes of such information produced in the Watergate investigation to the House Judiciary Committee. These examples of Congress receiving all of the relevant evidence in other analogous investigations help show how unprecedented it would be for Attorney General Barr to withhold from Congress potentially significant portions of Special Counsel Mueller's report and the underlying evidence and materials. The same type of information can and should be produced here. I ask unanimous consent to include these materials in the record. This subpoena authorization gives this committee the ability to compel production of the full report and related documents if the Attorney General departs from these and other precedents and refuses to produce to Congress the complete record of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. I yield back the balance of my time. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for any comments he may have on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as the substitute, that's fine, but I'm glad we're using props today, because this is what's happening here. The chairman wants you to look at one thing when the reality is another thing. He's wanting you to look at this bottle of water and say, this is full, and then he's wanting you to look at this bottle of water and say, it's full too. It doesn't work. You can't say the Starr report, or even going back to impeachment, which we'll get to in a minute, and then come along and say Mueller is full too. It's the same. They're not the same. And as long as we perpetrate this fraud of saying that they're the same, then we're going to continue down this process of saying that we've got a problem here. Because the Starr report, which actually came out, let's actually go to what it said. The Starr had a requirement under the Independent Counsel Act, 28 U.S.C. 595, to advise the House of Representatives of any substantial credible information which may constitute grounds for an impeachment. Remember, it was the Janet Reno Justice Department, after the Starr report was written, that rewrote the regulations that we're under today. Starr, Mueller, two different things. And if we understand this, then we can understand the problem we have here. I feel for the chairman. He's trying to make an analogy that just won't work. He's doing as good a job as he possibly can. It just doesn't work. The other interesting issue in here is he's used two precedents for getting this information, both of which are impeachment. If the chairman truly wanted to get at this information, then he can go to what I believe many in their heart desire is open the impeachment inquiry. Maybe that's what we're going to get to today. But if you use the precedent of impeachment, not the precedent of subpoenas, then there's a problem. And we've got to understand this is nothing. If this was simply about the Mueller report today, and we had waited till after we got the Mueller report and we said there's still stuff we don't like, then I can see this happening. I can see why we'd come together and ask for subpoenas. Any attorney on this, that's what you do. When you don't get what you want, you ask for the subpoenas, not beforehand. When the Attorney General has already said, I'm going to do this. So the problem is, look, it's a tough problem. I feel for him. But as long as you're trying to compare the full and the empty and say they're both full, that's going to be a problem. The problem also I have with this is it just not about the Attorney General and the Mueller report? Is he went ahead and added 5 other individuals. Why were those 5 other individuals? Let's take a look at the names. The 5 other individuals: Don McGahn, Steve Bannon, Hope Hicks, Rance Priebus, and Ann Donaldson. All of which have either gave information or answered and responded to their initial letters. Why are these 5? They're close to the president. The closer you get to the president, the press writes about it. The press writes about associates of the president get a subpoena. Let's take this for what it is. We don't have our popcorn machine yet. We're getting it for our side because this is great political theater. But as long as they're trying to convince you that this one and this one are the same, then we're going to go down the same sad road. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to comment on one thing. The argument is made that the prior history is irrelevant because Mr. Jaworski and Mr. Starr operated under a different law than Mr. Mueller is operating. That fact is true. However, we have the same constitutional rights as the committee did in those days, and we have the same constitutional duty as the committee did in those days. And we have the right and the necessity to get all the information to fulfill our constitutional duty. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Then the clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
What? The gentleman reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Representative Ken Buck of Colorado. At the end of the resolution, insert the following paragraph. This resolution shall not be construed as authorizing the chairman to issue a subpoena for the production of information where such production would violate Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in Greek mythology, Prometheus looked down from the heavens and saw man eating raw meat. Out of pity, He stole fire from the heavens, came to earth, and gave fire to man so man could cook his food. This gift had unintended consequences. Man used fire to forge metal into swords. With new weapons, man went to war. This is a cautionary tale about unintended consequences, a lesson we should be mindful of today. The current special counsel regulations were adopted in 1999 after Congress allowed the old independent counsel law to expire. These Clinton-era regs authorized the appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel and guided his investigation. They also limit what the AG can release. So they strike a balance between disclosure and protection of classified and grand jury information. This resolution, however, leads us down the wrong path. The resolution fails to ensure certain information remains protected. This will have unintended consequences. First, this resolution risks politicizing future special counsel investigations. By protecting grand jury information from public release, the regs encourage the special counsel to produce a candid report for the AG. By compelling release of an unredacted report, however, the committee risks chilling future investigation and jeopardizes the special counsel process. This will not serve justice, it will undermine it. Second, the public release of the full report could compromise intelligence sources and methods. General Barr expressed concern about this issue in a March 29th letter to Chairman Nadler. As much as Democrats may hate the president, I would hope you love America more. If love trumps hate, we should afford the AG time to redact classified information before providing us with a report that can be shared with the public. Third, this resolution fails to protect grand jury information from disclosure. This is information that by law needs to be protected as confidential. Under the regs, the AG is required to redact this information. General Barr wrote to the chairman on March 29th that, quote, "We are preparing the report for release, making the redactions that are required. The special counsel is assisting us in this process. Specifically, we are well along in the process of identifying and redacting the following: material subject to Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6E that by law cannot be made public," end quote. Rule 6E is information produced in front of the grand jury. As a former prosecutor, I hold the grand jury process and the protection against disclosure sacrosanct. I would urge my colleagues, do not undermine the grand jury process for the sake of politics. This sets a dangerous precedent that is dangerously short-sighted. My amendment is simple. It modifies the resolution to limit the subpoena authority to exclude production of any information related to grand jury materials. This amendment is consistent with the special counsel regs that have been in place for 20 years, over which time Democrats and Republicans in Congress during 2 Democratic administrations and 2 Republican administrations have respected. This amendment is also completely consistent with H-Con Res 24, Chairman Nadler's resolution that the House passed by a vote of 420 to 0 on March 14th. If you voted for Chairman Nadler's resolution 3 weeks ago, you essentially voted for the special counsel regulations, and you also voted to protect grand jury information from disclosure, the principle found in my amendment. For the sake of consistency, you should report my amendment today. It will help ensure we avoid unintended consequences. I ask unanimous consent that Attorney General Barr's letter of March 29, 2019 to Chairman Nadler be included in the record.
Without objection.
I urge a yes vote on the amendment.
Does the gentleman from Rhode Island insist on his point of order?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Rhode Island does not insist on his point of order. I will now recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The amendment says that this resolution shall not be construed as authorizing a subpoena for the production of information, of Rule 6E information. This committee's request for grand jury materials, which is to say the 6E information, is fully consistent with past instances, which I've outlined in my initial comments, in which the Justice Department has provided this information to Congress. The Justice Department can provide these materials to Congress by seeking authorization from the District Court, as it has in the past. In response, for example, to Republican-led congressional requests, the Justice Department turned over unprecedented levels of materials in the 114th and 115th Congress, including classified materials, deliberative process documents, and information related to ongoing investigations. We need these materials to fulfill our constitutional obligations, period. Our chief constitutional obligation is to hold the President accountable, especially in an instance where the Department of Justice says it cannot hold the president accountable because, as a matter of law, you cannot indict a president, and in which the Attorney General tells us that a president cannot commit obstruction of justice. Those judgments must be made by Congress, not by a political appointee, the Attorney General. We need this information to make those judgments, and the interests can be protected by this Congress deciding which of that information can be released publicly. But Congress is entitled to all of it, and therefore I ask opposition to this amendment. Is there any other discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, the chair and his supporters are putting the cart before the horse. And I just draw the attention of the committee to today's roll call. Hardly a Republican mouthpiece. And what does it say? Mueller magic, not in subpoenas. Democrats can send a message, but it's one without teeth. I will arrogate myself to become a dentist for the next 4.5 minutes. The chairman of the committee, the distinguished gentleman from New York, says that there was grand jury material that was submitted both in the Nixon and Clinton impeachments. That is correct. But that grand jury material was submitted only after the court in D.C. allowed it to be shared with Congress and made public. That's not happened in this case if there is any grand jury material in the Mueller report, and I think we all know that there is grand jury material in the Mueller report. So the thing to do to put teeth into a subpoena is for Congress and this committee to go to court and to ask for an order allowing for the release of the grand jury material. Otherwise, you're going to see the Justice Department move to quash the subpoena that I'm sure will be issued today, and it will be in court for months and maybe years until the Supreme Court decides this issue, because it is a dispute between the legislative and executive branches of government.
Gentleman yield.
Let me finish, please. And I will be happy to be a co-plaintiff in the motion before the district court, as I'm sure all of us would be, because the Nadler resolution that was passed 3 weeks ago was passed unanimously. I voted for it. All of my Republican colleagues voted for it. And the way to get the material that is sought by this subpoena quickly, promptly, and without extended litigation is to go to court and get the same kind of order that Mr. Starr got when he sent his material over as independent counsel, and what Mr. Jaworski got when he sent his material over as special prosecutor in the Richard Nixon impeachment. Now, secondly, I think we all want to get to the bottom of this. And it's only full disclosure, in my opinion, that we'll get to the bottom of this. But the law requires that there be certain conditions precedent to get that full disclosure. One of which, as far as the grand jury material and Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, is going to court and getting the order, if the court should so desire and be required to allow the Justice Department to release this material. Otherwise, the Justice Department puts itself in the same position as a grand jury witness who breaks the secrecy rule and releases his or her testimony before the grand jury. And that's a federal crime. So, it seems to me that if we want to protect witnesses under the same rule that the Justice Department is being protected, we ought to do what we need to do first, and that's go to court and let the judge make the decision. Now I'm happy to yield to the chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. We will, as appropriate, go to court. We think we need a subpoena first, but we will go to court. We've asked the Attorney General to go to court. He has thus far declined our request, but we will do whatever is necessary, be it subpoena or courts, to get this material.
Reclaiming my time. I don't the thing is Mr. Starr got the appropriate order without us being on his back. Jaworski got the appropriate order without the Judiciary Committee being on its back. And that material was used in both the Nixon and in the Clinton impeachments.
Will the gentleman yield for question?
No, I will not. And as I recall, there were obstruction of justice articles of impeachment voted out by this committee, and in the case of Clinton, approved by the House of Representatives, and that was an issue in both of those impeachments. So, again, look at roll call. Again, roll call is not printed by the Koch brothers, and it says Democrats can send a message, but it's one without teeth. It's about time that when we want to send a message, we send one with teeth. Then hopefully the rest of the news media will not be duped, as roll call was not, in getting it right. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Texas.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, who sit on this committee to do justice and to adhere to the rule of law. As I read the resolution proposed by the chair and the majority, it provides an authorization. It does not dictate an issuance of a subpoena. And I refer my colleagues to really some of the underlying reasons why we need to move forward on a subpoena. For all we know, the Attorney General may respond and present us with the Mueller report in its totality today at the end of business. But in his letter on March 24th, the Attorney General started out by saying that it was his intent to summarize the principal conclusions reached by the Special Counsel. And of course, he tried to walk that back, but in essence, he tried to give us in 4 pages a complete summary of the entire Mueller report. He goes on to say on the question of obstruction of justice that the DOJ did not make a traditional prosecutorial judgment. That may be accurate, but the standards that you adhere to by the second constitutional body, the executive, in Article 2, has a larger parameters as to whether or not the administration followed the rule of law and actually adhere to guidelines or actions appropriate for a President of the United States. Further, Attorney General attempted to swat away the idea of any Russian coordination. He did that by suggesting that the Attorney Mueller did not find an underlying crime and therefore refused to move forward on the obstruction. He refused to move forward on the obstruction on the basis of not an indictment or a crime, and we also know that Attorney General Barr has already made his point very clear about his position on the indictment of a president. We do not sit here in the role of a grand jury to indict the president, but we sit here as a body that has to proceed with its constitutional duties to provide oversight and transparency. Let me share with my colleagues what has happened in the past. Dan Burton, former chair of the Oversight Committee, issued 1,000 unilateral subpoenas in the 1990s regarding the Clinton administration. Lamar Smith of the Science Committee issued 25 subpoenas in his first year of chairmanship. Before 2015, this committee had not issued one subpoena in 21 years. Chairman Issa issued 100+ subpoenas, exceeding by over 20% the number of subpoenas from Dems and Republicans lawmakers of any committee. And then Chairman Gowdy of the Benghazi Committee, who sent U.S. Marshals to 70 witnesses' homes without asking any one of them to come voluntarily. I frankly believe that we are being both fair and balanced in our efforts.
Gentlewoman, yield.
Be happy to yield.
Just for the record, I was chair of this committee for 6 years, and I didn't sign one subpoena at all. I got what I needed out of the administration without having to compel it. So there's a difference between nice and being less than nice.
Mr. Sensenbrenner, thank you. I'm restoring my time or reclaiming my time. As you well know, you have not been mentioned You have not been mentioned, nor has the Judiciary Committee been mentioned, but the point being made is that there's been a history of subpoenas offered in other areas and other committees. And in this instance, I think the Judiciary Committee is being extremely fair. So thank you so very much for that clarification that Chairman Sensenbrenner did not. But in this instance, I believe that the committee is being fair. Mr. Nadler is being fair. This is a resolution to authorize the issuance of a subpoena. And I ask my colleagues to support this resolution. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arizona. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that an article published April 1st, 2019 in The Atlantic, written by Ben Wittes and entitled Bill Barr Has Promised Transparency, be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Wittes is the editor-in-chief of Lawfare and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. That's the same think tank where Norm Eisen, a member of the chairman's staff, is also a senior fellow, and Barry Burke, another member of the chairman's staff, has published extensively. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the gentleman from Arizona. Mr. Chairman, we're discussing basically what the standard is for release of grand jury testimony in the context of an independent counsel or special counsel investigation. And thankfully, you announced the standard on September 9th, 1998, when you appeared on the Charlie Rose Show. That's the same day that independent counsel Ken Starr, and I'll repeat that, the same day that independent counsel Ken Starr delivered his report into the Clinton investigation to Congress. Here's what you said when explaining why it would be unwise and unfair to release grand jury materials. Quote, now Mr. Starr, in his transmittal letter to the Speaker and the Minority Leader, made it clear that much of this material is Federal Rule 6E material. That is material that by law, unless contravened by a vote of the House, must be kept secret. It is grand jury material. It represents statements which may or may not be true by various witnesses. Salacious material, all kinds of material that it would be unfair to release. End of quote. Our chairman even went so far as to suggest in that interview that certain material, quote, must not be released at all. End of quote. I do want to mention that under the independent counsel statute, Congress held a statutory role of oversight, so it would have at least been proper for Congress to consider if grand jury materials should be released. But that law has expired. Under current law, the Attorney General is left with the responsibility of protecting grand jury materials. A different person responsible for deciding, different responsibility altogether. Despite changes in the law, the chairman's concerns from 1998 about the questionable value in releasing grand jury material and the need to protect those materials are still true today. The chairman's position was also on display 3 weeks ago when the House unanimously approved his resolution, H-Con Res 24, calling for the release of the special counsel report while excluding from disclosure any information protected by law which would necessarily protect grand jury material. Nevertheless, in a New York Times op-ed this week, the chairman wrote, quote, the Department of Justice has an obligation to provide it, meaning the full Mueller report, in its entirety without delay. Mr. Chairman, you had it right over 20 years ago. You supported the protection of grand jury information, and I agree with that. You had it right 3 weeks ago. Everyone on this committee voted for your resolution to protect against the release of 6E materials. Mr. Chairman, Attorney General Barr agrees with you. Last week, he wrote to you to tell you that he was working with the special counsel to redact grand jury materials. Your historic standard, one you held for 7,492 days from September 8, 1998, at least until March 14, 2019, is the same standard that can be found in my amendment. The standard says that grand jury materials should not be disclosed. That's the right standard. And I urge the committee to adopt the standard, and I yield back to the gentleman from Arizona.
Reclaiming my time.
Mr. Chairman.
From Rhode Island.
Excuse me, I have time still. I reclaimed my time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Biggs, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Ken Buck, Representative Buck's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the resolution. And one thing I want to point out is that when I hear people intimate that the chairman merely has the authorization to issue a subpoena, I get this feeling that maybe this isn't a done deal, but it is a done deal. Because the chairman, in his response to the gentleman from Wisconsin, said very clearly that before going to court, we're going to issue a subpoena. So the normal process would naturally be to go to the court and ask for this information to be made available. But that's not what's going to happen here. You're going to see subpoenas issued, and they're going to be issued because, as the chairman said in his opening statement, the Attorney General Barr may do this, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, and President Trump may do that. In other words, he would suggest that this would be conditional, but he is acting, and this resolution is going to go forward regardless of what Mr. Barr provides, even if it's in compliance with Rule 6E. My time's expired.
The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make two brief points. One is the gentleman from Wisconsin referenced the Starr report and the Jaworski report as precedent for not issuing a subpoena and, in fact, going to court. It should be noted that in both of those cases, the special and independent counsel went to court to seek authorization for the release of the grand jury testimony before it was delivered to Congress. They did that on their own. It didn't require Congress to litigate it. So those individuals recognized that it was important when they delivered the report to also deliver the underlying documents, and they sought permission from the court to do it. That has not happened in this case. In fact, Mr. Barr has done just the opposite. He's attempted to keep this information from Congress. So the notion that we should just wait and sort of pray and hope that Mr. Barr will suddenly find his way to the courthouse to seek authorization, I think is foolish. This subpoena will require him to take that action. Because as the gentleman from Wisconsin said, he could move to quash the subpoena. That's one course of action. He could also go to court for the production of 6E material so he can comply with the subpoena. And that's what we're hoping he will do if, in fact, they're interested in getting this information for Congress. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment to set the precedent so that, in fact, this committee can get the full report and all the supporting materials so we can do our oversight responsibility. And as the chairman said, our constitutional responsibilities have not changed, even if some regulation has. I urge a no vote on the amendment and yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to point out that I was right 21 years ago. I'm right now, and it's totally consistent. Because we are urging now that the underlying 6E material be produced to the committee. In 1998, that material had been produced to the Congress, and what we were discussing was its release to the public. And before 6E material is released to the public, it has to be reviewed because some of it should not be released to the public for privacy and other reasons. But that determination was made then by Congress, and it should be made now by Congress. We are asking now that the material be given to Congress so we can fulfill our constitutional responsibilities. In 1998, the material had been given, or prior to this debate, to that debate, to Congress, so Congress could fulfill its constitutional responsibilities. And my comments on the floor then, and the debate then, was not about whether the material should go to Congress. It already had. It was about whether it should be released to the public in its entirety. And I said then that you can't release 6E material entirely to the Republic. I'm sorry. In its entirety to the public without reviewing it, and that's still true, but it was then and should be now released to the Congress, to this committee, in its entirety.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
Would the gentleman support releasing to the public the material that we redacted in the Clinton impeachment?
I'll reclaim my time. I'd like to focus on the issue before this committee.
No.
I'm reclaiming my time, I think, from the chairman. But I, again, want to suggest that this is an important responsibility of this committee to ensure that it is clear that no one is above the law, that we follow the facts where they lead us, that this investigation was conducted on behalf of the American people. When our democracy was attacked by a foreign adversary, we fought hard to protect Mr. Mueller so he could complete his work free from political interference. And now we have a right, this committee has the right and the responsibility to see the full contents of this report and the supporting materials. And I urge a no on this amendment and yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, we have the right and the duty to protect certain material from public disclosure. And if we redacted it from the public 20 years ago, I assume we had good reason to do that. But the question before us now is not public release of information. It's release to Congress to do our constitutional duties, and it's a very different situation. I yield back to the gentleman.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I've been listening to the arguments this morning. I've been trying to decide what's worse. Was it last week when within 24 hours of the Attorney General issuing his summary of the Mueller findings, I listened to the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, demand the immediate full release of the Mueller report without consideration for classified information. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee telling all 17 intelligence agencies over which he had oversight, essentially, I don't give a damn about classified information. I want the full release of that report. Or was it this week when I'm sitting here today listening to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee say, I don't care what the law says. I don't care what the special counsel regulation says. I don't care that the Attorney General has complied with both, that the Attorney General has done everything the law requires, everything the special counsel regulations require, and is promising to do more, but that's not good enough, and now he's going to be subpoenaed for that. In that theater of the absurd, I'm still trying to decide which of those is worse. The Attorney General didn't comply with the Democrats' arbitrary April 2nd demand deadline because he can't comply, because the law precludes him from complying, because the Attorney General wasn't going to commit crimes to comply with that deadline. Mr. Chairman, today I heard you say over and over again, Congress requires, there are constitutional rights, or there's a necessity for this information. What I didn't hear was what law, the special counsel, where in the special counsel regulation does it say that the Attorney General must turn over an unredacted full special counsel report? The special counsel regulation doesn't say that. No law says that. The Attorney General has promised to provide as much transparency as he possibly can, but I'm afraid that's never going to be good enough for some in here. And that's because we're here having this argument because some, not all, of my Democratic colleagues promised the American people evidence that never existed. Some, not all, Democrats shouted fire in the theater of the American public, feeding a false Trump-Russia collusion narrative that never existed and that, in fact, some Democrats created with a fake, phony dossier. Now, Special Counsel Mueller, who some Democrats demanded be protected so that he could do his job, did his job. And the minute that he finished doing that job and said, no collusion, that the Trump-Russia collusion narrative doesn't exist, is not real, protect Bob Mueller suddenly has become to hell with Bob Mueller. I have always believed that Bob Mueller could write the definitive narrative on how Russia tried to meddle in our election. I have never called what Bob Mueller was doing in that regard a witch hunt. But Bob Mueller has provided his findings to the Attorney General, who has accurately summarized those. And with respect to Trump-Russia collusion, Bob Mueller has said there are no witches. So these investigations should end. We should move on. We shouldn't be issuing subpoenas today. But if we're going to issue subpoenas today, let's not issue a subpoena for the Mueller report. Let's issue one for Bob Mueller.
Would the gentleman yield?
Would the gentleman yield for a question? Let me finish this thought. Let Bob Mueller come, and let's ask Bob Mueller whether or not he thinks that the report that he created should be disclosed without considerations for redactions of classified national security information, or without redactions for grand jury information, or other information relating to ongoing investigations. I may have questioned Bob Mueller's actions in certain regards, but I have never questioned his integrity, and I would be happy to hear his answer under oath before this committee with respect to that issue. So I urge all my colleagues to follow the law and to therefore support the Buck Amendment. And I yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say, Mr. Ratcliffe, who I respect greatly, said that Mr. Barr accurately described in the Mueller report. We don't know that. That's why we want to see it, so we can know if he accurately did it. He talked about people who threw fire. He might be suggesting I'm one of those fire throwers. I want to find out if I was wrong, and I want the public to see it too. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got to say, I've witnessed one of the proof positive of the brilliant mental acumen of our chairman as he explained adroitly how he was right 21 years ago and is right today. Just a work of beauty in that argument. As Chairman said, 21 years ago, we should always remember this is a prosecutor's report. By its nature, it's one-sided. He also said it was salacious material, all kinds of material that it would be unfair to release. I would point out the gentleman didn't know exactly what all the material was at that time, and we don't know at this time either. In a February 1999 New York Times article, our current chairman called the Starr Report impeachment efforts a, quote, partisan coup d'etat, unquote. What has gone on in this country did absolutely, unequivocally, no doubt about it, involve collusion of people at the highest level with a foreign entity to try to bring down a candidate and then bring down a sitting president. That was collusion between top FBI officials, justice officials, a former MI6 intelligence officer who has been discredited by those same justice officials, FBI officials, but they colluded with him to try to bring down a candidate and now a sitting president. Enough is enough. At some point, we've got to say what will be written in the annals of history of this country as an outrageous attempt at a real coup d'etat was unsuccessful. The truth came out about who really colluded with foreign agents. And by the way, they did involve the Democrats' campaign and a foreign agent who was colluding with some of Putin's agents in all likelihood, as he was not even in Russia, but was talking by phone to Russian agents in his efforts to help the Clinton campaign and top justice officials bring down a sitting president. And for us to continue this outrageous assault on the office of president, even after the truth has come out that there was no conspiracy by the Trump campaign or President Trump or anybody in his family with Russia, and to continue to push, we're still going to make a big deal out of this. We can't stand the fact that the facts show it was the Democrats that colluded with foreign agents to try to change the outcome of the election. Enough is enough, for heaven's sakes. Let's please move on. There was a time when I loved and appreciated the current chairman's desire to protect privacy rights. I saw that dramatically eroded during the Obama administration, but I am still hoping and praying that our now chairman's once great desire to protect privacy rights and to try to hold back the bounds of what Orwell described as happening now. Obviously, the only thing he got wrong was the year, because we've seen what the Obama administration did with those Orwellian abilities to spy on American citizens. It's time to go back and clean up the mess that's been made over years of abuse. And this subpoena, the subpoenas, is not what we need to be voting for, and I support my friend's amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you very much. I wanted to read into the record the information regarding the chairman of the Benghazi Committee sent U.S. Marshals to a witness house without making without asking that witness to come in voluntarily. And I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman from Georgia yield back.
I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. The gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I support Representative Buck's amendment. What basically we're doing here is, in my opinion, the Democrats are asking Attorney General Barr to violate the law. It's not only against the law, but it would even be criminal to disclose grand jury material without a court order. It's obvious to me that this is just a continuation of an attempt to undermine the President of the United States. For the last 2 years, members on this committee have said that there has been collusion with the Trump administration and President Trump with Russia to undermine the 2016 election, and as revealed in the summary, this is absolutely not true. So I really wish that we could work on big issues instead of continuing this circus on undermining the President of the United States. I serve on 3 committees, and in every single committee, it is obvious from the very first organizational meeting that there is a coordinated attempt by the Democrats to undermine the President of the United States, and this is all about the 2020 presidential election. The public really wants us to work on big issues together, and I ask my Democratic colleagues to do that and quit this circus. I will yield time to the gentleman, Mr. Jordan from Ohio.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I too wish to support the Buck amendment. I would just ask the fundamental question: why are we here? Seems to me we're here because the Mueller report wasn't what the Democrats thought it was going to be. In fact, it was just the opposite. What did the Attorney General tell us that the principal finding of Mr. Mueller's report were? No new indictments, no sealed indictments, no collusion, no obstruction. On the
Mr.
question,
Jordan, will the gentleman yield?
I only got a little bit of time because
I only have a short question. You made reference to the Mueller report. Have you seen it? Because we haven't.
No, I've seen the principal findings from the Attorney General.
Well, would the gentleman yield? For a quick question? I promise it's short. Mr. Jordan? You reported that the report states that there's no obstruction. What's your basis for saying that?
Did the sentence where he said they did not find obstruction? I understand the sentence you're referring to where he talks about no exoneration either, but then there are 3 paragraphs after where he points out that there was not the elements of obstruction. In fact, the report, the letter from the Attorney General referencing the Special Counsel report said no new indictments, no sealed indictments, no collusion, and as I just pointed out, did not find obstruction. On the question of collusion, it was very clear. He said there were multiple opportunities for people associated with the Trump campaign to collude, and they didn't. So multiple times where the forbidden fruit was placed in front of them and they didn't bite. But all that does, I would also point out this. There's been reference from the Democrats relative to Watergate and the Clinton special counsel. Watergate, there was a break-in. With Clinton, there was perjury. With the chief charge of this special counsel's investigation, there was no collusion. But here we are today. Well, actually 3 weeks ago, the chairman of the committee launched 81 letters to 60-some different individuals. And now today we're going to subpoena documents that the AG said he will give us in a matter of days. But maybe the most important point, I think, is the one that my colleague from Texas made, Mr. Ratcliffe. The idea that the chairman of the Intelligence Committee said he wants everything made public, including classified information, and the idea that the chair of the Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, said last week, or excuse me, this week, that he wants everything made public, including grand jury material, that's maybe the scariest thing of all. So the Attorney General has said he's going to turn this over in a matter of days. Let's wait. Let's get the information, and then let's look at it then. With that, I would yield back the remaining 20 seconds to the gentlelady from Arizona.
I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I support the Buck Amendment. When the human body sees life expire within it, one of the final sounds that it can make in dramatic and loud fashion is a death rattle. And I would suggest to the American people that what they're witnessing is the death rattle of the Democrats' Russia collusion lie. For 22 months, my colleagues on the other side, many of them said there was actual evidence of collusion. And so now, clearly seeing that that is not true, we observe our colleagues moving through the stages of grief. First, we saw shock and surprise. My colleagues would huddle together after the findings of the Mueller report were released, wondering what to do next, what play to run after losing all credibility with the American people. And after shock, we now are in the stage of denial, where the principal findings of the Mueller report, they just can't be true. They can't be accepted. They must be false. There must be more information we can discover. I know we're beginning the baseball season, so perhaps a baseball analogy would be appropriate. This would be like saying, well, we've lost the game, but we have to tweeze through the box score to see if we won the third inning. That's what is essentially happening with the desire of Democrats in the production of these subpoenas and voting on them today. It also represents a stark departure from the standards and statements that my own Democratic colleagues have laid out just last Congress and this Congress. I'm quoting now from the Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi, in February of 2018. She said, President Trump has surrendered his constitutional responsibility as Commander-in-Chief by releasing highly classified and distorted intelligence, by not protecting intelligence sources and methods. He just sent his friend Putin a bouquet. Well, there was no bouquet, no untoward relationship with Vladimir Putin, but there was a statement from the Speaker of the House acknowledging that if you do not review sources and methods, you are derelict in your duty to the country. Well, now that they're going through their stages of grief, perhaps we're approaching bargaining, because now they're trying to bargain away their own standards. But it's not just the Speaker of the House. Let's look to statements from the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler. He said on June 28th of 2018, Republicans are requesting documents they know they cannot have. He continued, and if the majority, speaking of the Republicans, is rightly denied, they will do their best to undermine the credibility of the Department of Justice. Well, Mr. Chairman, you are now asking for documents you know you cannot have. And you're doing so in order to erode confidence in the Attorney General who leads the Department of Justice, because he has concluded that there was not collusion and that your principal Russian narrative was not truthful, was not credible. We were right, you were wrong, and the American people know it. And so as we proceed now on this unfocused 81-pronged investigation that the Judiciary Committee has launched, as we continue to have these mindless votes on unnecessary subpoenas, I sincerely hope that the American people will remember what things the Democrats were saying just months ago, that there was collusion, that there was actual evidence of collusion, and that sources and methods could never be disclosed as a consequence of our fidelity to our oath and to the people of this country. Let's have some consistency, and let's at least have some acknowledgement that you all were not telling the truth to the American people for an extended period of time. We were, and you should not be trusted. I yield back.
The question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the Buck Amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, ask for a recorded vote.
A roll call vote has been requested. As your name is called, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Jeffries?
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? No. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? No. Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia? No. Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? No. Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean? No. Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell? Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar? No. Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins? Yes. Mr. Collins votes yes. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Aye. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Yes. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe? Yes. Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Aye. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Aye. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko? Aye. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein?
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes.
Clerk will report. One more. The clerk will suspend.
Ms. Bass votes no.
Has everyone else voted? The clerk will report.
Ms. Jackson-Lee is recorded as no.
They're not leaving. You have no vote. Do they know that? They're not leaving. You have no vote.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 16 ayes and 24 noes.
A majority having voted against the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Is another amendment? Gentleman is recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I called for the
Wait a minute, the clerk will report the amendment. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I called for the appointment of a special counsel to look into charges of collusion before Mr. Mueller was appointed because I believe the President was completely innocent of these outlandish charges and that a full and independent investigation would show that. Now it has. And I, too, want to see as much of the report made public as quickly as humanly possible to put the lie to these politicians who've been telling us for more than 2 years that they held in their hands irrefutable evidence of coordination between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. I want to know all aspects of this lie and who was responsible for using it to tear this country apart and to interfere with the legitimate election of the president. But what I don't want to do is illegally release material in that report that is related to ongoing investigations into political corruption at the highest levels of the FBI and the Justice Department. It is clear that high-ranking officials entrusted with the law enforcement powers of our country abused this trust to influence the 2016 presidential election and ultimately to undermine its outcome. It is inconceivable that the Mueller investigation did not look into the fake Steele dossier that was the source of these outlandish charges and was knowingly invoked by these officials in their attempt to delegitimize the constitutional right of the American people to elect their president. The premature release of such information while the Inspector General is conducting investigations into this matter and while future prosecutions of these officials is possible would itself be a deliberate and calculated attempt to obstruct justice by this committee, and I'm opposed to the motion.
The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to agree to the resolution as amended. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The ayes have it. The resolution. A recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner?
No.
Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat? No. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson-Lee, you are not recorded.
Aye.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Ratcliffe votes no.
Does any other member wish to vote who hasn't voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 24 ayes, 17 noes.
The ayes have it. The resolution as amended is agreed to. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all of our members for attending. The markup is adjourned.